At the head of the casket, Bruno, Margaret's shaggy hunting dog, stood frozen. His fur bristled, his eyes wide with alarm. He barked furiously, the sound echoing through the church like a warning. People flinched. A few turned to one another, confusion etched on their faces. Why was Bruno acting this way? What was he reacting to? And more importantly, why was he staring at the casket? Comment S to let me know you like this video. Inside the church, the atmosphere shifted abruptly. All eyes turned anxiously toward Bruno, the dog who wouldn't stop barking. His front paws scratched against the wooden floor, as if trying to signal something. The echoes bouncing off the old stone walls made his bark sound even sharper, reverberating through the air like an ominous warning. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Why is he acting like that?" a woman whispered, her voice unsteady. "Is there something in the casket?" another person asked, shivering. No one had an answer, but everyone could feel the tension rising like a storm about to break. At the front of the room, Reverend Callahan furrowed his brow, tightening his grip on the Bible in his hands. He adjusted his collar, a bead of sweat trickling down his temple. "Calm down, it's just a dog," he said, but his voice lacked its usual steadiness. "Someone take him outside." Bruno didn't move. He let out a low growl, stepped back slightly, then suddenly lunged forward, placing his paws against the edge of the casket, barking louder than ever. The sharp, piercing sound tore through the suffocating silence of the church. Aidan, Margaret's grandson, was standing nearby and quickly grabbed the leash, trying to pull the dog away. "Bruno, stop it!" he commanded, but Bruno wouldn't listen. He kept clawing at the wooden lid, his wild eyes filled with urgency. A cold shiver ran down Nathan's spine. A stranger to most, he had stood quietly in the background until now, merely observing. But he knew the signs of something unnatural when he saw them, and every instinct in him was screaming that something was terribly wrong. "If it's just a dog barking at nothing," Nathan spoke up, his gaze locking onto Reverend Callahan, "then why do you look so nervous?" His words cut through the air like a blade. The room fell into dead silence. Reverend Callahan stiffened. He blinked rapidly, his trembling hand unconsciously reaching for his collar again. Around the room, uneasy glances were exchanged, fear beginning to creep into the mourners' expressions. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then suddenly, Bruno let out a long, eerie howl, a chilling, drawn-out sound that sent goosebumps crawling over every inch of skin in the room. All eyes turned toward the casket. The wooden floor beneath them seemed to tremble ever so slightly. A cold draft slipped through the cracks of the stained glass windows, making the candle flames flicker wildly, dancing as if something unseen had entered the room. Nathan could feel it now, the truth pressing in on them, something someone desperately wanted to keep buried. He swallowed hard, stepping forward, his eyes never leaving the Reverend. "I think it's time we open the casket," he said, his voice steady and firm. Under the wavering candlelight, Reverend Callahan's face turned pale, as if he had just seen a ghost. The air inside the church grew thick and heavy, as if everyone had stopped breathing at once. Nathan's words still hung in the air, sending a wave of tension rippling across every face. Bruno stood motionless, his brown eyes gleaming in the dim candlelight, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. He was like a living statue, poised to spring into action at any moment. Reverend Callahan opened his mouth but couldn't find his voice. His throat was dry, his trembling hands clutching the edge of his robe. No one missed that detail. He was afraid, terrified. "Open the casket," a voice called from the crowd. "That's right. We need to know what's going on," another person shouted. The murmurs swelled into a restless, growing wave of unease. People started rising from their seats, exchanging anxious glances. Curiosity had overtaken the fear that had gripped them just moments before. Reverend Callahan clenched his fists. "You don't understand! Don't touch it!" he cried out, but his voice no longer carried authority, only raw panic. But it was too late. Nathan stepped forward, placing his hands on the edge of the casket. A strange chill radiated from the black-painted wood, as if it held not the remains of the dead, but a secret never meant to be uncovered. Click. The lid creaked open. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then a blood-curdling scream shattered the silence. The entire room recoiled, some stumbling back into their seats, others clasping their hands over their mouths to keep from crying out. Inside the casket was not Margaret Whitmore, the beloved woman they had come to mourn. It was a man. His hair had gone gray, his face twisted in a mask of terror. Dark bruises ringed his throat, but the most chilling detail of all, his eyes were wide open, frozen in an expression of sheer, unrelenting horror. Reverend Callahan staggered backward, his lips quivering. "No! No, this isn't possible!" Bruno let out a low, menacing growl. But this time, he wasn't growling at the casket. He was staring at Reverend Callahan. The church descended into chaos. Some people screamed, others stumbled back, distancing themselves from the casket as if it carried a curse. The man inside wasn't Margaret Whitmore. It was Lawrence Hale, a wealthy merchant who had mysteriously vanished 2 weeks ago. Reverend Callahan staggered, his back slamming against the pulpit, his breath ragged. Sweat dripped down his forehead, his wild eyes darting around like a trapped animal. "Explain yourself, Reverend," Nathan demanded, stepping forward. Bruno growled louder, pressing against Nathan's legs, his gaze locked onto the man standing on the altar. Reverend Callahan panted, his eyes flicking around as if searching for an escape. But the crowd was closing in. There was nowhere left to run. I don't know anything about this," he stammered, but the quiver in his voice only deepened the congregation's suspicion. "Liar!" a woman shrieked. "You organized this funeral. You handled the casket. You knew Margaret wasn't in there." A chill ran down Nathan's spine. The pieces were falling into place. Margaret wasn't dead. But if she wasn't, then where was she? And why was Lawrence Hale's body here instead? Bruno barked furiously, as if urging Nathan to act. And then, Nathan saw it, a faint red stain on the Reverend's sleeve. Blood. "You killed him," Nathan said, his voice low but razor sharp. "You killed Lawrence Hale." Reverend Callahan's eyes widened in shock, a flicker of sheer panic crossing his face, before it twisted into something else. Rage. "Shut your mouth!" In a frenzied blur, he lunged forward, a gleaming knife flashing from beneath his robe. Gasps of horror filled the church as he charged at Nathan. But Bruno was faster. The dog sprang, sinking his sharp teeth deep into the Reverend's arm. Callahan howled in agony, the knife clattering onto the church floor with a metallic ring. Nathan seized his moment. He tackled Callahan, slamming him to the ground. The congregation rushed in, furious hands pinning down the man they had once revered. Reverend Callahan had been exposed, but the biggest question remained unanswered. Where was Margaret Whitmore? And what other secrets were still waiting in the dark? The commotion in the church hadn't even begun to settle when a trembling voice broke through the noise. "Margaret! Margaret is still alive!" Silence fell like a heavy weight. Every breath was held, every movement stilled. An older man, his face pale with shock, stepped forward from the pews. It was Arthur Whitmore, Margaret's younger brother. Nathan spun around, his sharp gaze locking onto Arthur. "Are you sure?" Arthur swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he pointed toward the back of the church. I saw her, I swear. Last night I heard someone crying in the church basement. I thought I was imagining it, but it was Margaret's voice." The air thickened. Margaret was alive. Then who had placed Lawrence Hale's corpse in the casket? And why? Nathan didn't hesitate. He shoved open the rear door of the church, plunging into the darkness, Bruno at his heels. Several others rushed after him, their hearts pounding with fear and anticipation. The basement was damp and cold, the stone walls slick with moisture. A single flickering bulb cast eerie shadows, making the space feel suffocating, trapped in its own haunting past. And then they heard it, a faint, weak whimper. "Help me!" Nathan froze. He sprinted toward the sound, shoving open an old wooden door. Inside, a frail woman was bound tightly to a chair, her mouth gagged with a filthy cloth. Her wide, terrified eyes met his. Margaret Whitmore. A collective gasp rippled through the group, shaking the church to its core. Hands rushed to untie her. She trembled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm not dead. I'm not dead." Nathan clenched his jaw, forcing down the rage boiling inside him. "Who did this to you?" Margaret's gaze darted around, as if terrified of something far worse than what they had already uncovered. She swallowed hard, her lips quivering as she finally forced out the words. "It was him." Footsteps echoed behind them. A shadow emerged from the darkness. Nathan spun around and came face to face with the last person he ever expected. Nathan froze as the figure stepped out of the shadows. Reverend Caldwell. His face was twisted with rage and fear, his hand gripping a gleaming knife that caught the dim light. "You shouldn't have interfered," his voice cracked. "I've kept this secret for years. No one can be allowed to destroy it." But before he could lunge, Bruno let out a ferocious snarl and sprang at him. The force of the loyal dog's attack sent the knife clattering to the floor. In an instant, Nathan tackled Caldwell, pinning him down against the cold, hard ground. It was over in the blink of an eye. The police were called. The long-buried truth finally came to light. Reverend Caldwell had deceived the entire town, embezzling church funds. And when Margaret uncovered his crimes, he had tried to silence her, replacing her with another body to cover up his sins. But it was Bruno's unwavering loyalty that shattered his twisted scheme. Margaret was saved. Justice was served. The town of Ashwood reclaimed its truth, its faith, and its peace. As the golden hues of sunset bathed the quiet streets, Nathan knelt beside Bruno, gently ruffling the dog's fur. "You did good, buddy,"